The wind screamed across the Montana high country like something wounded and furious, tearing through charred timber and broken fencing with a violence that seemed personal. Jack Brennan stood in what used to be his uncle's driveway, boots sinking into ash-darkened mud, staring at the skeleton of a life he'd never wanted to inherit. The ranch house was gone, reduced to blackened beams jutting from the earth like ribs picked clean by scavengers. Snow had begun to fall, fat flakes that hissed when they touched the still warm debris, and somewhere in the ruins of the stable, something moved. Not the wind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Something alive, deliberate, and watching him with an intensity that made the hair on his neck stand straight. When Jack finally saw the horse, limping through the smoke-stained doorway with blood streaking its foreleg and eyes that burned with an intelligence no animal should possess, he knew his uncle's death had left behind more than debts and ashes. The gelding stopped 10 feet away, pinned him with a stare that felt like accusation and invitation both, then turned and limped back into the darkness of the collapsed stable as if daring him to follow. Jack Brennan had come to Montana to sell this cursed land and disappear. But some doors, once a creature opens them, cannot be closed again. And some inheritances demand more than a signature on a deed. Jack Brennan had spent the last 15 years running from anything that resembled responsibility, and he'd gotten good at it. At 43, he had perfected the art of temporary, working oil rigs in Texas when the pay was good, bartending in Nevada when it wasn't, and disappearing the moment anyone asked him to stay longer than a season. His ex-wife had called him a ghost in boots, and she wasn't wrong. He'd learned early that attachment was just another word for loss waiting to happen. And after his daughter stopped returning his calls 3 years back, he'd stopped trying to prove otherwise. So when the lawyer's letter found him in a motel outside Billings, informing him that Walter Brennan, the uncle he'd met exactly twice in his life, had died and left him 200 acres in Cottonwood Valley, Jack's first instinct was to ignore it entirely. But the letter had included a second page, a handwritten note from Walter himself, dated 2 weeks before the fire that killed him. It said only, "Jack, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're all that's left. The land matters. Don't let them take it. There's more here than you know. Come see for yourself. The horse will show you." That last line had nearly made him throw the whole thing in the trash. The horse will show you. It sounded like the ramblings of a man who'd spent too much time alone, talking to animals and seeing patterns in the clouds. But Jack had been 3 months behind on rent. His truck was burning oil, and the idea of selling 200 Montana acres to some developer was the closest thing to a future he'd had in years. So he'd driven north through a November storm, watching the land turn from brown plains to snow-dusted pine forests, and told himself he'd be gone by Christmas. Cottonwood Valley looked like a town in the process of forgetting itself. Main Street ran 4 blocks, half the storefronts empty, their windows filmed with dust and faded for lease signs. The Silver Saddle Saloon still had its lights on, and the church at the end of the road stood white and clean against the gray sky like a last act of defiance. A few pickups were parked at odd angles, and an old man in a Carhartt jacket watched Jack drive past with the weary suspicion of someone who'd seen too many strangers come and go. Jack stopped at the only gas station, a sagging structure with pumps that looked older than he was, and asked the attendant for directions to the Brennan Ranch. The kid, no more than 20, had given him a long look. "You family?" he'd asked. Jack had nodded. The kid wiped his hands on a rag, not meeting his eyes. "Then I'm sorry for your loss. Your uncle was a good man. Didn't deserve what happened." Jack had wanted to ask what he meant by that, but the kid had already turned back to the register, and something in his posture said the conversation was over. The road to the ranch was barely a road at all, more a suggestion of gravel and frozen ruts that wound through pine stands and open meadows where fence posts leaned like drunks. Jack passed a few neighboring spreads, their barns weathered and their fields empty, and saw no one. The valley felt abandoned, as if the people who remained were just waiting for permission to leave. When he finally reached the property, the sight of it punched the air from his lungs. The house was gone. Not damaged, not salvageable, but erased. The fire had been so hot that even the stone chimney had cracked and collapsed inward, leaving only a blackened footprint and the smell of destruction that no amount of snow could cover. The stable was still standing, barely. Half the roof had caved in, and the walls were scorched black, but the structure hadn't fully surrendered. Jack sat in his truck for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled, and felt the weight of the place settle over him like a coat he couldn't shrug off. He'd expected ruin, but this was something else. This was violence. He climbed out, boots crunching on frozen ground, and walked toward the remains of the house. The lawyer had said the fire started in the kitchen, an electrical fault, but standing here Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the destruction had been too thorough, too complete. He crouched near what might have been the living room, sifting through debris with a stick, finding nothing but twisted metal and charred wood. A coffee cup, somehow intact, sat in the ash like a grave marker. He was about to stand when he heard it. A low, rumbling sound, halfway between a groan and a warning. Jack turned slowly, and that's when he saw the horse. It stood in the ruined doorway of the stable, a chestnut gelding with a white blaze running down its face, favoring its left foreleg. Blood had dried in dark streaks along its shoulder, and its coat was matted with ash and mud. But it was the eyes that stopped Jack cold. They were dark, clear, and fixed on him with an intensity that felt disturbingly human. The horse didn't move, didn't startle or shy away. It just watched, as if measuring him against some standard Jack couldn't see. He raised a hand slowly, the way he'd learned as a kid around his grandfather's horses, and took a step forward. The gelding's ears flicked, but it held its ground. Jack took another step, and the horse snorted, shaking its head sharply. Then it turned, limped deeper into the stable and stopped, looking back over its shoulder. The message was unmistakable. "Follow me." Jack's rational mind told him to get back in the truck, call the vet, let someone else deal with this. But something older, something that remembered the weight of reins in his hands and the smell of hay in summer, pulled him forward. He followed the horse into the stable, stepping carefully over fallen beams and scattered tools. The interior was darker than he expected, the collapsed roof blocking most of the light, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and something else, something earthy and old. The horse moved to the back corner, near what had once been a tack room, and stopped beside a section of floor where the dirt looked disturbed, as if something had been dragged or dug up recently. It pawed at the ground once, then looked at Jack again with those unsettling, knowing eyes. Jack knelt, ignoring the pain in his knees, and brushed away loose dirt with his hand. His fingers hit something solid, metallic. He dug faster, uncovering the edge of a rusted iron ring bolted to a wooden hatch. A root cellar or something like it. He pulled, and the hatch groaned but didn't budge. He tried again, throwing his weight into it, and the wood splintered, giving way with a crack that echoed through the stable. The horse stepped back, nostrils flaring, but didn't run. Jack peered into the darkness below. Stone steps led down. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Into a space he couldn't see the bottom of, and the air rising from it was cool and dry, untouched by the fire. He pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and descended carefully, each step creaking under his weight. The cellar was small, maybe 10 by 10, with stone walls and a dirt floor. But it wasn't empty. Along one wall, stacked neatly on wooden shelves, were boxes. Dozens of them, old and water-stained but intact. Jack opened the nearest one and found papers, maps, letters, all carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. He pulled out a letter at random and read the first line by the light of his phone. To whoever finds this, the truth about Cottonwood Valley is buried deeper than anyone knows. And if you're reading this, someone tried to make sure it stayed that way. Jack's pulse quickened. He rifled through more boxes, finding surveys, legal documents, old photographs of men in suits standing beside mining equipment, and handwritten notes in his uncle's cramped handwriting. One note, paperclipped to a map, read, "Hutchins knows. He's been buying up land for 2 years. If he gets the Brennan Ranch, he gets the access point. Can't let that happen. The horse knows where to dig." Jack looked up at the cellar entrance, where the horse's silhouette was just visible against the gray light. The animal hadn't moved, as if standing guard. Jack climbed back up, boxes in his arms, and set them on a workbench that had somehow survived the fire. He looked at the horse, really looked, and saw the intelligence there again, the patience. This wasn't a frightened animal. This was something else. The sun was setting by the time Jack finished reading through the first 3 boxes, and the cold had seeped into his bones. His uncle hadn't just been a rancher. He'd been a researcher, an archivist, obsessed with the history of Cottonwood Valley and the land beneath it. The documents told a story Jack hadn't known existed. A century ago, the valley had been the site of a mining operation, gold and silver mostly, that had collapsed after a series of cave-ins killed dozens of workers. The company responsible had covered it up, bought silence, and eventually abandoned the site. But Walter's notes claimed the mine hadn't been fully closed. It had been sealed, and something valuable had been left behind. Not just but something the company had feared more than financial loss. The notes referenced deposits of historical significance, artifacts protected by federal law, and evidence of indigenous heritage sites intersecting with mining tunnels. Jack didn't fully understand it, but he understood enough. His uncle had been sitting on something big, something that would make the land invaluable not for ranching, but for preservation, for history. And someone, this Hutchins the notes mentioned, wanted it buried again. Literally. Jack's hands shook as he set down the last letter. It was addressed to him, written the day before Walter died. Jack, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but if you do, you need to understand what's at stake. Raymond Hutchins has been pressuring me to sell for months. He's offered money, made threats, sent men to intimidate me. I won't sell. This land belongs to the people who died here, to the history that was stolen. I've documented everything, and I've hidden it where only someone who cares will find it. The horse, Ranger, he's smarter than any animal I've known. He'll lead you if you let him. Trust him. And Jack, if I'm gone, don't let them win. Fight for this place. It's the only thing I've ever fought for, and it's worth it. The letter wasn't signed, but Jack didn't need a signature to know his uncle had been terrified when he wrote it. And now Jack was standing in the ashes of that fear, holding the evidence that had likely gotten Walter killed. He looked at the horse, Ranger, standing patient and still in the fading light. The gelding's ears were forward, eyes bright despite the injury. Jack felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, the weight of matching, of being needed for something beyond his next paycheck. He'd come here to sell and run, but running suddenly felt like cowardice, and Jack Brennan, for all his faults, had never been a coward. He stepped closer to Ranger, slowly, and laid a hand on the horse's neck. The animal was warm beneath his palm, the muscle solid and alive. Ranger turned his head, just slightly, and exhaled a long breath that fogged the cold air between them. Felt like a pact, like agreement. Jack whispered, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't let himself feel in a decade. All right, boy, you brought me here. Now let's figure out what we're supposed to do. The wind picked up, howling through the broken stable, and the first stars began to prick the sky. Jack Brennan, broke and alone and standing in the ruins of a life that wasn't his, felt the stirrings of purpose he'd thought long dead. He didn't know yet what the hidden treasure truly was, or how deep the danger ran, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't leaving. Not until he understood what his uncle had died protecting, and not until he made sure Ranger's loyalty hadn't been for nothing. The night closed in around them, the valley silent and watchful, and somewhere in the darkness, men who wanted this land buried were already making plans. But Jack had been underestimated his whole life, and Ranger had survived fire and blood to deliver a message. Together, they were about to become a problem Raymond Hutchins hadn't anticipated. The fight for Cottonwood Valley had begun, and neither man nor horse intended to lose. Jack Brennan hadn't slept in a bed for 3 nights, and his body was starting to remind him of every bad decision he'd made in the last 20 years. The cab of his truck had become his temporary shelter, parked just outside the burned stable where Ranger refused to leave. Each morning Jack woke with his neck cramped and his breath fogging the windows, and each morning he found the horse standing in the same spot, as if keeping vigil over something Jack couldn't yet see. The money situation was worse than he'd admitted to himself. He had $400 in his checking account, a maxed-out credit card, and a truck that needed new brake pads before it killed him on one of these mountain roads. The lawyer had explained that the estate was technically his, but there were liens against it, unpaid property taxes going back 3 years, and a mortgage Walter had taken out and never paid off. Until those were cleared, Jack couldn't sell even if he wanted to, which meant he was trapped here, broke and freezing, in a valley that felt like it was holding its breath. On the 4th morning, Jack drove into town with the last of his cash and bought coffee, a box of granola bars, and a bag of feed for Ranger. The woman at the counter, 60ish with gray hair pulled back in a bun, had looked at the feed and then at him with something like pity. She hadn't said anything, but the look had burned. He'd driven back to the ranch feeling smaller than he had in years, the kind of small that came from being seen as a failure by strangers who didn't owe him kindness. When he pulled up to the stable, Ranger was standing outside, favoring that injured leg but otherwise alert. Jack climbed out with the feed bag and set it down near the workbench. The horse approached slowly, sniffed the bag, then looked at Jack with what could only be described as skepticism. Jack laughed, a bitter sound. "Yeah, I know. Not exactly premium, but it's what we've got." He opened the bag and poured some into an old bucket he'd found, and Ranger ate carefully, as if rationing his strength. Jack watched him, really watched, and noticed details he'd missed in the chaos of the first days. The horse was older than he'd thought, maybe 15 or 16, with scars along his flanks that spoke of a hard life. But there was a dignity in the way he moved, a refusal to be diminished by circumstance. Jack recognized it because he'd spent his whole life trying to fake the same thing. While Ranger ate, Jack went back to the cellar. He'd been avoiding it, truth be told, because what he'd found there terrified him in ways he couldn't articulate. The documents weren't just historical records. They were accusations, evidence of crimes committed by powerful men who were still alive, still operating. His uncle's notes detailed how Raymond Hutchins, owner of Hutchins Development, had systematically bought up land in the valley over the past decade, using shell companies and intermediaries to hide his involvement. The goal, according to Walter's meticulous research, was to gain control of the entire valley floor so he could reopen the old mining operations under the guise of historical tourism. But the real prize was something Walter had only hinted at in his notes. There were minerals in the ground, rare earth elements that had become incredibly valuable in recent years, worth millions if extracted properly. And beneath the Brennan Ranch, where the old mine tunnels ran deepest, was the primary access point. Hutchins didn't just want the land. He needed it. Without it, his entire operation was landlocked, inaccessible, worthless. Jack sat on the cellar steps, the papers spread around him, and felt the trap closing. If he sold to Hutchins, he'd be complicit in the destruction of whatever history and heritage his uncle had been trying to protect. But if he didn't sell, he had no way to pay off the debts, no way to keep the land, and no way to survive the winter. He was being squeezed from both sides, and the smart move, the move he'd been making his whole life, was to walk away and let someone else deal with it. But every time he thought about leaving, he'd look up and see Ranger standing there, patient and immovable, and the idea would die in his throat. The horse had survived the fire that killed Walter. He'd stayed when he could have run, had led Jack to the cellar, had refused to abandon the land even when injured and alone. Ranger's loyalty was a rebuke to every cowardly instinct Jack possessed, and he was starting to hate the animal for it. On the 5th day, the visitors came. Jack was trying to patch a hole in the stable roof using salvaged boards and rusty nails when he heard the vehicles. 2 black SUVs rolled up the gravel drive, moving slow and deliberate, their windows tinted dark. They parked in front of the burned house, and 4 men climbed out. 3 of them were large, the kind of large that came from gyms and protein shakes, wearing jackets that didn't quite hide the bulk of firearms underneath. The 4th man was older, mid-50s, with silver hair combed back and a wool coat that probably cost more than Jack's truck. He walked like he owned the ground beneath his feet, and when he smiled at Jack, It was the smile of a man who'd never been told no. "Jack Brennan?" the man called out, his voice smooth and practiced. Jack climbed down from the roof, hammer still in his hand, and walked over slowly. Ranger had appeared from inside the stable, ears pinned back, and positioned himself between Jack and the strangers. The horse's body language was unmistakable. "Threat." "That's me," Jack said. The man extended a hand. "Raymond Hutchins. I believe you've inherited Walter's property. I'm sorry for your loss. Your uncle was a stubborn man, but I respected him." Jack didn't take the hand. He just looked at it until Hutchins lowered it with a small, tight smile. "What do you want?" Jack asked. Hutchins glanced at the ruins of the house, the collapsed stable, the scorched earth. "I want to make you an offer. Your uncle and I had a disagreement about the value of this land, but you strike me as a more reasonable man. I'm prepared to offer you $200,000 for the property, cash, no contingencies. I'll even cover the outstanding liens and taxes. You could walk away from this today with a clean slate and money in your pocket." 200,000. Jack's heart hammered. It was more money than he'd seen in his life, enough to disappear, start over somewhere warm where the wind didn't cut through his jacket and the ghosts of dead relatives didn't haunt burned-out stables. He could be in Mexico by the weekend, drinking cheap beer on a beach and forgetting Cottonwood Valley ever existed. But Ranger stamped his hoof, a sharp crack against the frozen ground, and Jack's focus snapped back. The horse was staring at Hutchins with something that looked like recognition, and not the good kind. The hair along Ranger's neck was raised, his nostrils flared, and a low rumble vibrated in his chest. Jack had never heard a horse growl before, but there was no other word for it. Hutchins noticed. His smile thinned. "That animal should be put down. It's injured, probably in pain. Keeping it alive is cruelty." "He seems fine to me," Jack said, his voice colder than he intended. Hutchins shrugged. "Your choice, but the offer stands. 200,000. I'll give you 48 hours to think it over. After that, the price drops." He turned to leave, then paused. "Your uncle thought he could fight me, Mr. Brennan. It didn't end well for him. I'd hate to see you make the same mistake." The threat wasn't even veiled. It hung in the air like smoke, and Jack felt his chest tighten with a fear he hadn't experienced since his 20s. When a bar fight had gone too far and he'd barely escaped with his ribs intact. Hutchins and his men climbed back into their SUVs and drove away slowly, kicking up dust that hung in the cold air long after they'd disappeared. Jack stood there, pulse racing, and realized he was gripping the hammer so tight his knuckles had gone white. Ranger nudged him with his nose, a gentle push, and Jack exhaled shakily. "I know," he muttered. "I know what you're trying to tell me." But knowing and acting were different things, and Jack Brennan had spent 15 years perfecting the art of knowing the right thing and doing the opposite. That night, Jack couldn't stay in the truck. He built a fire in the stable using broken boards and sat on an overturned crate, watching the flames and trying to think. Ranger stood nearby, his injured leg tucked, eyes half closed but not asleep. The horse never seemed to fully sleep, as if rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Jack pulled out his phone and stared at the lawyer's number. One call and he could start the process of selling. Hutchins would handle everything and Jack would be free. Free to run, free to fail somewhere else, free to be the man he'd always been. But his thumb hovered over the screen and wouldn't press down. He thought about his daughter, Emily, who'd been 7 the last time he'd seen her. She'd be 20 now, probably in college, probably wanted nothing to do with him. He'd missed her childhood because he couldn't stay in one place long enough to be a father, couldn't hold a job or a marriage or a promise. He'd told himself it was because he wasn't built for that kind of life, that some men were meant to drift. But sitting here in the cold, watching a horse that refused to abandon a burned ranch, Jack wondered if he'd just been lying to himself for decades. Maybe he wasn't broken. Maybe he was just a coward. The fire crackled, and Ranger shifted, his eyes opening fully to look at Jack. In the firelight, the horse's gaze seemed almost sad, as if he understood the battle happening inside Jack's head and knew the outcome was far from certain. Jack set the phone down and picked up one of his uncle's letters instead. This one was older, dated 10 years back, and it was addressed to someone named Margaret. Margaret, I know you think I'm crazy for staying here, for fighting this fight. Maybe I am. But every time I walk this land, I feel the weight of the people who died here, whose stories were buried and forgotten. Someone has to remember. Someone has to stand. If not me, then who? I've made my choice. I just hope when the time comes, someone else will make the same one. Jack read the letter 3 times, each pass hitting harder than the last. His uncle had been alone, just like Jack was now. But Walter had chosen to stand anyway, had chosen to matter even if it killed him. And it had killed him. The fire was dying. Jack stood and added more wood, then walked over to Ranger. The horse didn't move, just watched as Jack reached out and rested his hand on the warm, solid neck. I don't know if I can do this, Jack whispered. I'm not him. I'm not brave, and I don't know how to fight men like Hutchins. I'm just a guy who's been running his whole life. Ranger turned his head, and for a moment, their eyes met. Jack felt something pass between them, a wordless understanding that was more real than any conversation he'd had in years. The horse wasn't asking him to be a hero. He was just asking him not to run. Not this time. Jack exhaled, a long, shaky breath that fogged in the cold air. All right, he said, more to himself than to Ranger. All right, I'll stay. At least until I figure out what the hell we're supposed to do with all this. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a vow or a promise. It was just a decision not to leave today, and maybe not tomorrow either. But it was enough. Ranger seemed to sense the shift. He lowered his head and rested it briefly against Jack's shoulder. A gesture so gentle and trusting that Jack's throat tightened with emotion he'd been holding back for years. He'd been alone for so long, untethered and invisible, and now this injured horse was looking at him like he mattered, like his choice meant something. Jack stayed there in the dark stable, hand on Ranger's neck, and felt the first stirrings of something he didn't dare name yet. Not hope exactly, but maybe its distant cousin. The kind of feeling that said maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep running forever. The next morning, Jack woke to the sound of Ranger moving outside. He climbed out of the truck, joints stiff, and found the horse standing near the burned house, pawing at the ground. Not aimlessly but deliberately in the same spot over and over. Jack walked over, curious, and saw that Ranger was digging near the remains of the stone chimney. The ground was frozen, but the horse was persistent, scraping away dirt and ash with his hooves. "What are you doing, boy?" Jack asked, crouching down. He brushed away the loose dirt Ranger had uncovered and felt something hard beneath. He dug with his hands, ignoring the cold, and unearthed a metal box about the size of a shoebox. It was old, the kind of fireproof safe people used to keep documents in, and it was locked. Jack turned it over, examining it. There was no key, no obvious way to open it without tools. He looked at Ranger, who was watching him with that steady, knowing gaze. "You knew this was here," Jack said, not really expecting an answer. "How the hell did you know?" Ranger snorted and stamped his hoof, as if to say the question was irrelevant. What mattered was that it had been found. Jack carried the box back to the stable and spent the next hour trying to pry it open with a screwdriver and a wrench. The metal was stubborn, rusted but intact, and he finally had to use the hammer to smash the lock. The box popped open with a screech, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather journal and a stack of old photographs. Jack unwrapped the journal carefully. The cover was embossed with initials he didn't recognize, and the pages were filled with handwriting that wasn't his uncle's. The first entry was dated 1893. "My name is Thomas Greystone, and I am writing this as a record of what has happened in Cottonwood Valley, in the hope that someday, someone will uncover the truth. The mine collapse was no accident. We were forced to dig deeper than was safe, into tunnels that should have been left alone. What we found there, what the company tried to take, it was not ours to claim. Men died. Men were silenced. And the land itself seemed to rebel against us. I fear I will not live to see justice, but I leave this account, hidden in the place where my family lived, in the hope that the land will remember what men choose to forget." Jack's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The journal detailed the mining operation, the greed of the company, the deaths of indigenous workers whose presence was never recorded in official documents. It described artifacts found in the tunnels, ceremonial objects and burial sites that were destroyed or stolen. And it described how the company, when the operation became unprofitable, had sealed the tunnels with explosives, trapping evidence and bodies alike beneath tons of rock. The photographs showed men in old-fashioned mining gear, standing beside equipment and carts. But there were other photos too, images of carved stones and pottery, fragments of a history that predated the mine by centuries. Jack felt sick. His uncle hadn't just been protecting valuable minerals. He'd been protecting a burial ground, a sacred site that had been desecrated and then buried to hide the crime. This wasn't just about money. It was about justice for people who'd been erased from history, whose deaths had been covered up so thoroughly that even their names were lost. And Hutchins wanted to dig it all up again, to finish what the original company had started, to extract profit from a place that should have been left in peace. Jack set the journal down and looked at Ranger. The horse was standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray morning light, and for the first time Jack understood. Ranger wasn't just a horse. He was a guardian, the last living creature who remembered what this place had been, who refused to let it be forgotten. Walter had known that. He'd trusted Ranger to lead Jack here, to show him what needed to be protected. And now Jack had a choice. He could take the journal, the photographs, the documents from the cellar and walk away. Give them to a museum, let someone else fight the fight. Or he could stay. He could stand on this land the way his uncle had, the way Thomas Greystone had tried to, and refuse to let the past be buried again. It wasn't a choice about money anymore. It was a choice about who he wanted to be. Jack stood slowly, his decision settling over him like a weight he'd been avoiding his whole life. He walked to the stable door and stood beside Ranger, looking out at the valley. The snow had started again, soft and steady, covering the burned ground in a blanket of white. Somewhere out there, Hutchins was waiting for an answer. Somewhere out there, men were planning their next move. But here, in this moment, Jack Brennan made a choice he'd never been brave enough to make before. He chose to stay. He chose to fight. And he chose to trust that a horse who'd survived fire and loss knew more about courage than he ever would. Jack spent the morning reinforcing the stable walls with whatever materials he could salvage from the wreckage. The work was hard. His hands blistered and bleeding by noon, but it kept his mind from spiraling into panic about what he'd just committed himself to. Ranger watched from a distance, occasionally moving closer to inspect Jack's progress with what seemed like critical assessment. At one point, when Jack had hammered his thumb instead of the nail, the horse had made a sound that was uncomfortably close to a snort of amusement. Jack had glared at him, and Ranger had simply turned away, tail swishing as if to say he'd seen better craftsmanship from amateurs. The temperature dropped as afternoon settled in, and Jack's breath came in visible clouds. He'd managed to patch the worst holes in the stable roof and shore up one wall that had been threatening to collapse entirely. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold against the wind and keep the snow out. He stepped back to admire his work, such as it was, and felt a small flicker of satisfaction. He'd built something, fixed something. It had been years since he'd done anything with his hands that wasn't just survival maintenance on a truck or a temporary living situation. Ranger approached slowly, his limp less pronounced than it had been days ago. Jack noticed the horse was putting more weight on the injured leg, though he still favored it when standing still. That was good. Whatever wound he'd sustained in the fire was healing, though Jack knew he should get a vet out here to look at it properly. The problem was money, or the complete absence of it. He'd spent the last of his cash on feed and basic supplies, and his credit card was so far past its limit that using it would probably trigger some kind of fraud alert. He was contemplating this depressing reality when Ranger did something unexpected. The horse walked past him, not toward the stable but toward the eastern pasture, the section of land that sloped upward toward the tree line. Jack watched, confused, as Ranger stopped about 50 yards away and looked back, that same deliberate stare he'd used when leading Jack to the cellar. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans and followed, curiosity overriding his exhaustion. The pasture was overgrown, choked with dead grass and scattered with fallen branches from the pine trees that bordered it. Ranger picked his way through the debris with careful steps, occasionally pausing to let Jack catch up. They walked for maybe 10 minutes, climbing gradually, until they reached a section of ground that looked different from the surrounding area. The earth here was disturbed, mounded slightly, as if something had been buried and the ground had settled unevenly over time. Ranger stopped at the center of the disturbed area and began pawing at the ground again, that same deliberate motion Jack had seen near the burned house. Jack knelt, his knees protesting, and brushed away dead grass and pine needles. Beneath the organic layer, the soil was darker, richer, and mixed with small pieces of stone that didn't look natural. He dug deeper with his hands, pulling away dirt until his fingers hit something solid. Wood, old and rotted but still intact enough to hold shape. He uncovered more, working faster now, until he'd revealed the outline of what looked like a wooden beam, hand-hewn and ancient. His pulse quickened. This wasn't random debris. This was a structure, something deliberately built and then buried or collapsed. He looked up at Ranger, who was watching him with what Jack could only describe as approval. The horse nickered softly, as if encouraging him to continue. Jack spent the next hour excavating, his hands numb from cold and his back screaming in protest. He uncovered more beams, arranged in a way that suggested a framework, possibly the entrance to something underground. A mine shaft, maybe, or a tunnel entrance that had been deliberately covered. The wood was too old to be from Walter's time. This was from the original mining operation, the one Thomas Greystone had written about in his journal. Jack sat back on his heels, staring at what he'd uncovered, and felt the weight of history pressing down on him. This was it. This was the access point Hutchins needed, the entrance to the sealed tunnels that ran beneath the valley. And Ranger had led him straight to it. The horse had known, somehow, that this was important, that Jack needed to see it with his own eyes to understand what they were protecting. Jack stood slowly, his legs shaking from exertion and adrenaline. He looked at Ranger, really looked, and saw the intelligence burning in those dark eyes, the purpose that had kept the horse alive through fire and injury and loss. This animal wasn't just smart. He was connected to this land in a way Jack couldn't fully comprehend, as if the earth itself had chosen him to be its witness, its guardian. "You've been protecting this place?" Jack said aloud, his voice rough. "How long? How long have you been here keeping watch?" Ranger didn't answer, obviously, but he stepped closer and pressed his forehead gently against Jack's chest. The gesture was so full of trust, so full of hope, that Jack felt something crack open inside him. He wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, pressing his face into the warm, dusty coat, and let himself feel the fear and responsibility he'd been holding at bay. He wasn't qualified for this. He didn't know how to fight developers or protect historical sites or stand up to men with guns and lawyers. He was just a broke drifter who'd never finished anything important in his life. But Ranger trusted him anyway. The land had chosen him, through his uncle's death and this horse's persistence. And walking away now would mean abandoning something bigger than himself. It would mean proving that every person who'd ever given up on him had been right to do so. Jack pulled back, wiping his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. "All right," he said, his voice steadier now. "All right, we need help. I can't do this alone and you can't either. We need to find people who can fight this the right way." Ranger's ears perked forward, as if he understood and agreed. Jack looked around the pasture, at the exposed beams and the disturbed earth, and made a decision. He needed to document everything, photograph it, create a record that couldn't be destroyed or denied. He pulled out his phone, grateful he still had battery, and started taking pictures. He photographed the beams, the surrounding area, the way the mound suggested a deliberate covering. He took close-ups of the hand-hewn wood, the weathering that spoke to its age. Then he hiked back to the stable, Ranger following at his careful pace, and retrieved the journal and photographs from the metal box. He photographed every page, every image, uploading them to a cloud storage account he rarely used. If something happened to the physical evidence, at least there would be a digital backup. By the time he finished, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of orange and purple. Jack's stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since the granola bar that morning. But he ignored it. Food could wait. What mattered now was making contact with someone who could help. Someone with the knowledge and resources to take this fight beyond just him and a horse against a development company. He thought about the lawyer who'd contacted him about the inheritance. The man had seemed decent, professional, but Jack didn't know if he could be trusted with something this big. He thought about going to the sheriff, but small-town law enforcement could be complicated, especially if Hutchins had money and influence in the area. Then he remembered something from his uncle's notes. There had been references to a historical society, a group based in Helena that specialized in indigenous heritage sites and mining history. Walter had been in contact with them, had sent them preliminary reports about what he'd found on the land. If anyone would understand the significance of what Jack had uncovered, it would be them. Jack searched for the organization on his phone, the signal weak but functional. The Montana Heritage Alliance. Their website described work on preservation, advocacy for indigenous rights, and legal battles against development projects that threatened historical sites. Perfect. He found a contact form and started typing, his cold fingers clumsy on the small screen. He explained who he was, that he'd inherited the Brennan Ranch, that he had evidence of a covered-up mining disaster and desecration of indigenous burial sites. He attached several of the photographs he'd taken and hit send before he could second-guess himself. The message disappeared into the digital void, and Jack had no idea if anyone would even read it, much less respond. But it was a start. It was action instead of paralysis, and that had to count for something. Ranger had made his way into the stable and was eating from the feed bucket, his movements slow but steady. Jack watched him, struck again by the horse's resilience. The animal should be dead. The fire should have killed him, or the injury should have made him too weak to survive this long without proper care. But here he was, eating and healing and refusing to give up on the land he'd sworn himself to. Jack pulled out the last granola bar from the box and ate it slowly, making it last. Tomorrow he'd have to figure out how to get more food. For both of them. Maybe he could find work in town, something temporary that would bring in enough cash to keep them going. It would mean leaving the ranch unguarded. But he didn't see another option. He couldn't protect the land if he starved to death trying. That night, Jack made himself a bed in the stable using old blankets he'd found in the truck and a saddle pad that had somehow survived the fire. It smelled like smoke and horse and leather, a combination that was becoming oddly comforting. Ranger settled near him, close enough that Jack could hear the horse's breathing, the soft sounds of an animal at rest but not quite asleep. Jack stared at the patched ceiling, watching shadows dance across the boards as the wind moved outside. His phone buzzed, startling him. He grabbed it, expecting spam, but the notification was an email from the Montana Heritage Alliance. His heart hammered as he opened it. The message was brief but urgent. Mr. Brennan, thank you for contacting us. The information you've sent is extremely concerning and potentially significant. We need to speak with you as soon as possible. Please call this number tomorrow morning. Dr. Helen Porter, Director of Field Research. Jack read the message 3 times, hardly believing it. Someone had responded. Someone believed him. He wasn't alone in this anymore. He showed the phone to Ranger, a ridiculous gesture. But the horse lifted his head and looked at the screen as if he could read it. They want to help, Jack said, his voice thick with relief. We've got allies now, people who know what to do. Ranger exhaled, a long breath that sounded almost like satisfaction, and lowered his head back to rest. Jack set the phone aside and felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the blankets. For the first time since arriving in Cottonwood Valley, he felt like maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The wind howled outside, rattling the stable walls, but inside it was quiet and still. Jack closed his eyes and let himself drift toward sleep, one hand resting on Ranger's shoulder, anchoring him to this moment, this choice, this fight that had somehow become his. Morning came cold and bright. Jack woke to find Ranger already awake, standing near the stable door and staring out at the valley. There was tension in the horse's posture, his ears swiveling toward sounds Jack couldn't yet hear. Then he heard it too. Vehicles, multiple engines coming up the access road. Jack scrambled to his feet, his body protesting, and joined Ranger at the door. 2 trucks were approaching, not the black SUVs from before but older pickups, work vehicles. They pulled up near the burned house and 5 men climbed out, all wearing jackets marked with the Hutchins Development logo. They weren't the hired muscle from before. These were workers carrying surveying equipment and clipboards, moving with the casual confidence of people who believed they had every right to be here. Jack stepped out of the stable, Ranger at his side, and walked toward them. The closest man, a heavy-set guy in his 50s with a graying beard, looked up and smiled. "Morning. You the new owner?" Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "Jack Brennan. What are you doing on my property?" The man's smile didn't waver. "Just doing our jobs. Mr. Hutchins hired us to survey the land, prepare some reports for the county. Standard procedure before development." "Development of what?" Jack asked, his voice flat. "I haven't agreed to sell." The man shrugged. "Above my pay grade. We're just here to measure and document. Won't take more than a few hours." He turned back to his team, dismissing Jack entirely. Rage flooded through Jack, hot and sudden. These people were walking on his land, acting like it already belonged to Hutchins, as if Jack's refusal to sell was just a minor inconvenience to be worked around. He stepped forward, putting himself between the surveyors and the eastern pasture where the tunnel entrance lay hidden. "Get off my property." The bearded man turned back, his smile fading. "Listen, friend, we don't want trouble. We're just doing our jobs." "Then do them somewhere else," Jack said, his hands clenching into fists. "You're trespassing. Leave now or I'll call the sheriff." One of the younger workers laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "The sheriff? Good luck with that. Hutchins owns half this county. You think anyone's going to side with you over him?" The words hit like a punch, confirming Jack's worst fears about how deep Hutchins' influence ran. But before he could respond, Ranger moved. The horse stepped forward, placing himself directly in the path of the surveyors, and his entire demeanor changed. The gentle, patient animal Jack had come to know vanished, replaced by something fierce and unyielding. Ranger's ears pinned flat against his head. His nostrils flared, and he stamped the ground with enough force to make the frozen earth crack. The sound echoed across the valley, sharp as a gunshot. The surveyors stopped, their confidence evaporating. The bearded man took a step back, his hand raised. "Easy, easy. We don't want trouble with your horse." Ranger advanced, slow and deliberate, his body language radiating threat. He wasn't charging, wasn't out of control, but the message was unmistakable. This land was under his protection, and anyone who threatened it would have to go through him first. Jack felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. This horse, injured and alone, was standing up to 5 grown men without hesitation, defending a place that mattered more than his own safety. It was the kind of courage Jack had spent his life avoiding, and seeing it in an animal shamed him and inspired him in equal measure. "You heard him," Jack said, his voice steady now. "Leave." The surveyors exchanged glances, their bravado gone. The bearded man muttered something under his breath, then gestured to his team. "Come on. We'll come back with authorization." They packed up their equipment quickly, throwing nervous glances at Ranger, who watched them with unblinking intensity until they climbed into their trucks and drove away. The sound of the engines faded into the distance, and the valley fell silent again. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and looked at Ranger. The horse turned to him, his ears forward again, the fierceness gone as quickly as it had appeared. He looked proud, satisfied, as if he'd just proven a point that needed proving. Jack laughed, a sound that was half relief and half disbelief. "You're unbelievable. You know that? Absolutely unbelievable." Ranger tossed his head, mane flying, and Jack could have sworn the horse was smiling. But the encounter had made one thing painfully clear. Hutchins wasn't going to back off. He was escalating, sending workers to intimidate Jack, to establish a presence on the land and make it clear that resistance was futile. And if the surveyors came back with legal authorization, or worse, with armed security, Jack didn't know how he'd stop them. He needed help, and he needed it fast. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number from the email. It rang 3 times before a woman answered, her voice brisk but warm. Dr. Helen Porter. Dr. Porter, this is Jack Brennan. I emailed you last night about the Brennan Ranch. Mr. Brennan, yes. Thank you for calling. I've been reviewing the photographs you sent, and I have to say, this is potentially one of the most significant discoveries in Montana in decades. Can you tell me more about the situation on the ground? Jack explained everything. The inheritance, the fire, Hutchins' attempts to buy the land, the threats, the journal he'd found, the tunnel entrance Ranger had led him to. Dr. Porter listened without interrupting, and when he finished, there was a long pause. Mr. Brennan, she said finally, what you're describing is a federally protected site under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. If there are burial sites on that land, and evidence of corporate malfeasance in covering them up, Hutchins can't legally develop there. But we'd need to verify everything, conduct proper surveys, and that takes time. Time I suspect you don't have. I don't, Jack admitted. He's already sent people onto the property. They'll be back, probably with lawyers or worse. Then we need to move fast, Dr. Porter said, her tone shifting to something more determined. I can be there tomorrow with a team. We'll document everything, file emergency injunctions if necessary. But I need you to hold that land until we arrive. Can you do that? Jack looked at Ranger, who was standing nearby, listening as if he understood every word. The horse met his gaze, steady and unwavering, and Jack felt the last of his doubt fall away. Yeah, he said. We can do that. Good. I'll send you the details tonight. And Mr. Brennan, what you're doing matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The call ended, and Jack stood there in the cold morning light, holding a phone that had just given him hope for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow help would arrive. Tomorrow the fight would become real. But today all he had to do was hold the line. He walked over to Ranger and rested his forehead against the horse's neck, feeling the warmth and strength radiating from the animal. One more day, he whispered. Just one more day, and we'll have backup. Ranger nickered softly, and Jack felt the vibration through his chest. It felt like a promise, a pact between man and horse that neither would break. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, 2 unlikely guardians of a land that demanded protection, and for the first time in his life, Jack Brennan felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The 24 hours that followed were the longest of Jack Brennan's life. He spent them preparing for the arrival of Dr. Porter and her team, but more importantly, preparing for whatever Hutchins might throw at them before reinforcements arrived. Jack walked the property boundaries, noting every access point, every weak spot in the fencing that still stood, every place where vehicles could enter. Ranger accompanied him on these surveys, moving with increasing confidence as his leg continued to heal. The horse seemed to understand the urgency, staying close and alert, his eyes scanning the tree lines and road approaches with the vigilance of a soldier on watch. Jack found tools in the equipment shed that had survived the fire, rusted but functional. He spent hours reinforcing the main gate with chains and a padlock he'd bought on credit at the hardware store in town, the clerk giving him a long look but processing the transaction anyway. Word had gotten around about the standoff with the surveyors, and Jack could feel the town choosing sides, most of them not his. At the general store, conversations stopped when he walked in. The woman behind the counter served him with tight-lipped efficiency, and when he tried to make small talk, she'd simply said, "You're making trouble for folks who just want to live quiet." Jack had left without responding, the weight of isolation pressing down on him harder than the Montana cold. But there were small mercies. The pastor at St. Michael's, Father Patrick O'Brien, had stopped by the ranch that afternoon driving a battered station wagon that looked older than Jack. He was a thin man in his 70s, with white hair and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. He'd climbed out slowly, eyeing Ranger with appreciation rather than fear, and approached with his hands visible and empty. "Mr. Brennan," he'd said, his voice carrying the remnants of an Irish accent. "I knew your uncle. Came to pay my respects and see if you needed anything." Jack had been so surprised by the genuine offer that he'd almost refused out of habit. But something in the old priest's face, a kindness that didn't demand anything in return, made him stop. "I could use some feed for the horse," Jack had admitted, "and maybe some information about what Walter was really up against." Father O'Brien had smiled, sad and knowing. Walter was a good man who saw injustice and couldn't look away. Cost him, as it always does. But he never regretted it, and he hoped someone would continue what he started. The priest had pulled 2 50-pound bags of feed from his station wagon, refusing Jack's protests about payment. "Consider it an investment in doing the right thing. Your uncle used to say that courage is just fear that said its prayers and decided to move anyway. Seems to me you're learning that lesson." Before leaving, Father O'Brien had pressed a piece of paper into Jack's hand with a phone number. "This is Grace Kendall. She lives 3 properties over, been here longer than anyone. If you need an ally, she's the one. She doesn't have much, but what she has, she'll share." The priest had driven away before Jack could properly thank him, and Jack had stood there holding the paper and feeling less alone than he had in years. That evening, Jack called Grace Kendall. The woman who answered sounded ancient, her voice cracked and rough like old leather, but sharp. "About time you called, Brennan. Patrick said you'd be getting in touch. What do you need?" Jack had explained the situation, expecting skepticism or refusal. Instead, Grace had laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "Hutchins has been trying to run me off my land for 5 years. Every trick in the book. But I was born on this property 83 years ago, and I'll die here too, God willing. You tell me when you need me, and I'll be there. I've got my grandfather's shotgun and enough stubborn to outlast any developer." Jack had thanked her, his throat tight, and hung up feeling like maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Night fell cold and clear, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Jack sat in the stable with Ranger, a small fire burning in a metal barrel he'd salvaged, going over the plan for tomorrow. Dr. Porter had sent detailed instructions via email. She'd arrive at 9 in the morning with a team of 4, 2 archaeologists, a lawyer specializing in heritage law, and a tribal liaison from the Blackfeet Nation. They'd need access to the tunnel entrance, the cellar documents, and the journal. If everything checked out, they'd file for emergency protection status, which would legally freeze any development until a full survey could be completed. It was a good plan, a solid plan, but it relied on Hutchins not making a move before dawn. Jack checked his phone obsessively, watching for headlights on the access road, listening for the sound of engines. Ranger stood near the stable door, his ears swiveling toward every sound, body tense. Around midnight, the horse suddenly went rigid, nostrils flaring. Jack was on his feet instantly, heart hammering. He heard it then, distant but unmistakable. Vehicles, multiple, coming up the road without headlights. Jack grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, Ranger at his side. The cold bit through his jacket, and his breath fogged the air. He counted at least 4 shapes moving through the darkness, trucks by the sound of them, approaching slowly as if trying to avoid detection. They stopped about 100 yards from the gate, engines idling, and Jack's stomach dropped. This wasn't a surveying crew. This was something else. Men climbed out, 8 or 9 of them, and they were carrying equipment that wasn't for measuring land. Jack saw the gleam of metal tools, sledgehammers, crowbars, and what looked like bolt cutters. They were going to force their way onto the property, and there wasn't a damn thing Jack could do to stop them alone. But he wasn't alone. Ranger stamped the ground, a sharp crack that echoed across the frozen valley, and the men paused. Jack pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered after 3 rings, her voice professionally bored. 911, what's your emergency? This is Jack Brennan at the old Brennan Ranch on Route 12. I've got 9 men trespassing on my property with tools to break in. I need law enforcement here now. There was a pause, the sound of typing. Sir, we've received no reports of criminal activity in that area. Are you sure they're not authorized to be there? Jack's temper flared. Authorized by who? I own this land, and I'm telling you they're trespassing. Send a deputy now, or I'll defend my property myself. Another pause, longer this time. Sir, I'm dispatching a unit, but it'll be at least 30 minutes. I advise you not to confront the individuals. The line went dead, and Jack stood there knowing 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours. By then, the men would have done whatever they came to do. He looked at Ranger, who was watching the intruders with focused intensity, and made a decision he knew was probably stupid but felt absolutely necessary. He wasn't going to let them waltz onto this land unchallenged. Jack walked to the gate, flashlight in one hand, and shouted across the distance. This is private property. You're trespassing. Leave now or you'll be arrested when the sheriff arrives. One of the men laughed, the sound carrying in the cold air. Another stepped forward, and Jack recognized him from the surveyors, the bearded man who'd backed down when Ranger had confronted him. But tonight, he looked bolder, backed by numbers and darkness. Mr. Brennan, we're here on behalf of Hutchins Development to secure this property for safety assessment. There's been reports of unstable ground and potential hazards. We're just doing our due diligence. At midnight, with crowbars? Jack shouted back. Try again. The man's smile vanished. We can do this easy, or we can do it hard. Your choice. But we're coming through that gate either way. Ranger moved then, not toward the gate but toward the side fence, and Jack realized what the horse had seen. Two men were trying to flank them, cutting through the wire fence to get onto the property from the east. Jack ran toward them, shouting, Stop! Don't you dare cut that fence. One of the men looked up, startled, and in that moment of hesitation, Ranger charged. The horse moved faster than Jack had seen him move since the injury, covering the distance in seconds. He didn't attack the men, didn't bite or kick, but he put himself between them and the fence with such sudden force that both men stumbled backward, one falling into the snow. The wire cutters clattered to the ground, and the man who'd fallen scrambled away, eyes wide with fear. At the gate, the bearded man cursed and gestured to his crew. Forget subtle. Cut the chains and get in there. Jack ran back, his lungs burning from the cold, and reached the gate just as one of them raised a bolt cutter to the chain. He didn't think, didn't plan, just acted. He grabbed a piece of lumber from the ground and swung it hard against the gate, the impact reverberating like a bell. I said, get off my land. The men hesitated, clearly not expecting this level of resistance from one person and a horse. The bearded man stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. You're making a mistake, Brennan. Hutchins doesn't forget. You could have walked away rich. Now you're going to lose everything, and nobody in this valley is going to help you. Jack met his eyes, his own fear transforming into something harder, something that felt like his uncle's stubbornness flowing through his veins. Then I'll lose everything, but I won't lose it without a fight. The standoff stretched, tension crackling in the frozen air. Then headlights appeared on the road, bright and sudden, and a vehicle approached fast. Jack's heart leaped, hoping it was the sheriff, but the truck that pulled up was Grace Kendall's ancient Ford, and the tiny woman who climbed out was holding a shotgun that looked almost as old as she was. Evening, boys, Grace called out, her voice carrying surprising strength. Seems like you're on the wrong property. This land belongs to Jack Brennan, and I'm here as a witness to your trespassing. The bearded man turned, clearly thrown by the appearance of an 83-year-old woman with a weapon. Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. Go home before someone gets hurt. Grace laughed, that gravel bucket sound. Son, I was shooting coyotes before your daddy was born. You want to test whether this old gun still works, you're welcome to try. But I wouldn't recommend it. Another vehicle arrived, this one Father O'Brien's station wagon. The priest climbed out, no weapon but a cell phone held high. I'm recording all of this, gentlemen, for the legal record. Please state your names and your business here. The men exchanged glances, their confidence crumbling. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to intimidate one broke drifter, not face down a community, however small. The bearded man's phone rang, and he answered it, listened, then hung up with a curse. We're leaving, but this isn't over. He gestured to his crew, and they retreated to their trucks, engines starting with aggressive revs. They drove away fast, kicking up gravel and snow, and the valley fell silent again except for the sound of Jack's ragged breathing. Grace walked over to him, lowering the shotgun. "You did good, boy. Held the line until help arrived. That's all anyone can ask." Jack wanted to say thank you, wanted to express how much their arrival had meant, but his throat was too tight. He just nodded, and Grace patted his arm with surprising gentleness. "Your uncle would be proud." "Hell, I'm proud, and I barely know you." Father O'Brien approached, putting away his phone. "I sent the recording to Dr. Porter and the sheriff's office. Whatever they were planning, it's documented now." He smiled, tired but satisfied. "Sometimes the best defense is witnesses. You're not alone in this, Jack. Remember that." They stayed until the sheriff's deputy finally arrived 45 minutes later, a young man who looked uncomfortable and took a statement with obvious reluctance. Grace and Father O'Brien gave their accounts, Grace with relish, and the deputy promised to file a report, though everyone present knew it would probably disappear into bureaucratic limbo. But the point had been made. Jack Brennan wasn't alone, and the land had defenders. Dawn came gray and cold, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that promised snow. Jack hadn't slept, had spent the remaining hours of night checking the property and making sure Ranger was all right. The horse seemed energized rather than exhausted, as if the confrontation had proven something he'd needed to prove. At 8:30, Jack's phone rang. Dr. Porter's voice was urgent. "Mr. Brennan, I'm 30 minutes out. I heard about last night. Are you safe?" "For now," Jack said. "But they'll be back. Probably with lawyers this time. Then we'd better move fast. I'm bringing everything we need to file the emergency protection. If the site is what you say it is, we can stop Hutchins today." She paused. "Jack, what you're doing, it matters. More than you know." The team arrived at 9 exactly, 3 vehicles pulling up to the gate. Dr. Porter climbed out first, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled back and eyes that missed nothing. She was followed by her team, 2 younger archaeologists carrying equipment cases, a sharp-eyed lawyer in a wool coat that looked too nice for fieldwork, and a Blackfeet man in his 40s who introduced himself as William Running Wolf, tribal liaison. Jack led them to the eastern pasture, Ranger walking alongside as if escorting honored guests. When they reached the disturbed ground and the exposed beams, Dr. Porter knelt and went very still. She brushed dirt away from the wood, examined the hand-hewn marks, and looked up at her team with something like awe. "This is authentic. Late 1800s, consistent with the mining period." She turned to Jack. "Show me everything else." They spent the next 3 hours documenting. The archaeologists photographed and measured the tunnel entrance. The lawyer reviewed Walter's documents and Thomas Greystone's journal, taking notes with increasing excitement. William Running Wolf walked the land with a reverence that made Jack's chest tight, stopping occasionally to touch the ground or close his eyes as if listening to something only he could hear. At the sight of the exposed beams, William knelt and sang softly in Blackfeet, a prayer or blessing that seemed to make the air shimmer. When he finished, he looked at Jack with grave respect. "This land has been waiting for someone to honor it. Your uncle tried. Now you're finishing what he started. Our ancestors thank you." Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, feeling the weight of generations pressing down. By noon, Dr. Porter gathered everyone near the stable. "We have everything we need. The site is clearly a sealed mining operation with evidence of indigenous burial grounds intersecting the tunnels. Under federal law, this land cannot be developed without extensive surveys and tribal consultation, which could take years. I'm filing the emergency protection order now." She pulled out a laptop and satellite phone, connecting to hotspot, and started typing with fierce concentration. The lawyer made calls, his voice sharp and professional as he spoke to county officials and federal representatives. Jack watched it all unfold, hardly believing it was real, that professional help had actually arrived and was taking action. An hour later, Dr. Porter looked up, triumph in her eyes. "It's done. The order is filed and approved. As of this moment, the Brennan Ranch is under federal protection as a site of historical and cultural significance. Any attempt to develop, survey, or disturb the land without authorization is a federal crime. She smiled at Jack. You did it. You held long enough for us to help. Jack felt his knees weaken, and he sat down hard on the frozen ground. Ranger came over immediately, pressing his warm side against Jack's shoulder, and Jack wrapped an arm around the horse's neck, letting himself feel the relief and disbelief and something that might have been joy. They'd won. Not forever, not completely, but enough to matter. The land was protected, his uncle's work vindicated, and the history buried here would finally be acknowledged. But the celebration was short-lived. At 2 in the afternoon, Raymond Hutchins arrived with his lawyer, a skeletal man in an expensive suit who looked like he fed on other people's misery. Hutchins climbed out of his SUV, face tight with barely controlled rage, and marched toward Jack. You think you've won? Hutchins spat. You think a piece of paper stops me? I've been working on this project for 5 years, invested millions. I'm not walking away because some broke drifter played hero. Dr. Porter stepped between them, calm and unmoved. Mr. Hutchins, I suggest you speak with your lawyer about the legal ramifications of threatening a federally protected site. Any further attempts to access or develop this land will result in criminal charges. Hutchins' lawyer leaned in, whispered urgently, and Hutchins' face went from red to white. He looked at Jack with pure hatred. This isn't over. I'll tie you up in court for years. You'll spend every penny you don't have defending this place. Jack stood slowly, Ranger at his side, and met Hutchins' eyes. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the urge to back down, to apologize, to make himself smaller. Then I guess we'll be seeing a lot of each other. Because I'm not leaving, and neither is this horse. This land is protected now, and you can't change that. Hutchins stared at him, at the determination in Jack's face and the horse standing like a sentinel beside him, and something in his expression shifted. Not surrender, but recognition. He'd lost this round, and he knew it. Without another word, Hutchins turned and left, his lawyer scrambling to follow. The SUV tore down the access road, spraying gravel, and disappeared. Silence fell over the property, broken only by the wind and Ranger's contented snort. Dr. Porter put a hand on Jack's shoulder. He'll try to fight this in court. Be prepared for that. But the law is on your side now, and so are we. The Montana Heritage Alliance will provide legal support, and the Blackfeet Nation has expressed interest in partnering on the preservation efforts. You're not alone anymore. Jack nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. William Running Wolf approached, his expression solemn. The land chose you just as it chose your uncle. It saw in you what you're only now discovering in yourself. Honor that choice. He placed a hand on Ranger's neck. And this one, he's been guardian here longer than any of us knew. He'll stay as long as he's needed. The team stayed until evening, finalizing paperwork and making plans for the formal archaeological survey that would begin in spring. They promised to return, to help however they could. And when they finally left, Jack stood in the driveway watching their taillights disappear into the dusk. He walked back to the stable where Ranger was waiting, and for a long time, he just stood there with the horse, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into something that felt like peace. He thought about calling his daughter, Emily, maybe trying to explain what he'd done, what he'd become. But that conversation could wait. For now, it was enough to stand here on land that mattered, with a horse that had refused to give up on him, and know that he'd finally done something worth doing. Grace Kendall drove by an hour later, honking her horn in celebration, and Father O'Brien stopped in with a casserole and a bottle of whiskey, both of which Jack accepted with gratitude. They sat in the stable, the three of them and Ranger, eating and talking about nothing in particular, and Jack realized this was what community felt like. Not grand declarations or promises, just people showing up when it mattered. The winter deepened, but Jack no longer felt the cold the same way. He'd winterized the stable properly, with help from Grace and a few other neighbors who slowly began to stop by, curious and then supportive. He found work at the hardware store, enough to pay for feed and supplies, and the owner, who'd been silent during the confrontation, quietly admitted he'd been waiting to see which way the wind blew before choosing sides. Jack didn't hold it against him. People survived however they could, and judgment was a luxury he no longer felt entitled to. The legal battles came, as predicted, but the Montana Heritage Alliance handled most of it, their lawyers more than a match for Hutchins' hired guns. The court filings dragged on, but each ruling went in Jack's favor, and eventually, word spread that fighting the Brennan Ranch was a losing proposition. Developers looked elsewhere, and Hutchins, after a particularly brutal defeat in federal court, quietly withdrew his interest and focused on projects in other counties. Spring came slowly, the snow melting to reveal the land beneath, and with it came the archaeological team. They set up tents in the eastern pasture and began the careful work of excavating the tunnel entrance and documenting what lay beneath. What they found exceeded even Dr. Porter's expectations. The tunnels did indeed intersect with indigenous burial sites, ceremonial spaces that dated back centuries. The mining company had destroyed some, but others remained intact, preserved by the collapse that had sealed the shafts. Artifacts were recovered, catalogued, treated with the respect they'd been denied 100 years ago. The Blackfeet Nation sent representatives who worked alongside the archaeologists, and a plan was developed to create a heritage site, a place of education and remembrance. Jack's role in all of it was simple. He was the landowner who refused to sell, who held the line long enough for truth to emerge. The Montana Heritage Alliance asked if he'd considered donating the land for permanent preservation, and Jack had looked at Ranger, who'd been grazing nearby, before saying yes, with the stipulation that he could live on the property for as long as he wanted, and that Ranger would be cared for there when Jack was gone. They'd agreed immediately. The formal dedication ceremony happened in June, on a day so beautiful it seemed staged. Hundreds of people came, tribal elders and historians and families whose ancestors had died in the mine. There were speeches and songs, blessings in multiple languages, and a plaque unveiled near the stable that read, "In memory of those whose stories were buried, and in honor of Walter Brennan and Jack Brennan, who brought them to light, guardians of truth." Jack stood beside Ranger during the ceremony, the horse's coat gleaming in the summer sun, his injured leg now fully healed. People came up afterward to thank them both, to touch Ranger's neck as if he were a talisman, and the horse accepted the attention with calm dignity, as if he'd always known this day would come. Emily called that night. She'd seen a news article about the dedication, about her father's role in protecting the land, and her voice when Jack answered was tentative but warm. "Dad, I saw what you did, what you've been doing. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you." Jack had cried then, for the first time in years, tears of relief and gratitude and a hope he'd thought long dead. They talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, and Emily promised to visit in August, to see the land and meet Ranger. Jack hung up feeling like maybe, just maybe, he could be a father again, even if it took starting from scratch. Summer turned the valley green and gold, and Jack settled into a life he'd never imagined. He worked with the Heritage Alliance, leading tours for school groups and researchers, telling Walter's story and his own. He learned about the history of the land, the people who'd lived there before the miners came, the ecology and the geology and the way everything was connected. Ranger became something of a local legend, the horse who'd led a broke rancher to hidden treasure and saved a valley's history. Children came to visit him, bringing apples and carrots, and Ranger tolerated their attention with patience, occasionally nuzzling a small hand or posing for photos. But his favorite time was still evening, when the tours ended and the valley grew quiet, and Jack would walk with him through the pastures, checking fences and watching the sun set over the mountains. On a night in late August, Emily arrived. Jack met her at the gate, his heart in his throat, and when she hugged him, it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. She stayed for a week, helping with the tours, learning the stories, and falling in love with Ranger the way everyone did. On her last evening, they sat on the porch Jack had built on the new cabin, small but sturdy, and watched Ranger grazing in the twilight. "You found yourself here," Emily said quietly. "I always wondered if you would." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. She squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you did, and I'm glad you stayed." After she left, Jack stood in the field with Ranger, the stars emerging overhead, and thought about the man he'd been when he first arrived. Broke, alone, ready to sell out and run. and now transformed into someone who stood for something, who'd built a life around protecting rather than escaping. The horse had shown him the way, literally and figuratively, leading him to treasure that wasn't gold or money but meaning, purpose, a reason to wake up and face each day with something other than dread. Years passed, seasons turning in their ancient rhythm, and Jack Brennan became part of the valley's story, the way his uncle had been. He aged into the role, his hair going gray, his hands weathering, but his eyes staying clear and focused. Ranger aged too, moving slower but no less dignified, and when the vet finally said it was time, that the horse's pain could no longer be managed, Jack made the hardest decision of his life. They buried Ranger on the eastern pasture, near the tunnel entrance he'd protected for so long, and the entire valley came out for the memorial. There were songs and prayers, stories about the horse who'd refused to abandon his post, and a stone marker placed at the grave. Ranger, guardian, he showed us the way home. Jack stood there long after everyone left, one hand on the cold stone, and whispered his thanks to an animal who'd saved his life by giving him something worth living for. The work continued. New guardians came, younger people inspired by the story, and Jack trained them, teaching them what Ranger had taught him. That some things matter more than profit, that courage is just showing up when it would be easier to run, and that the land remembers everything even when people forget. He lived simply, kept his cabin clean and his fences mended, and every evening he'd walk to Ranger's grave and talk about the day, about the visitors who'd come and the progress being made. He liked to think the horse could still hear him, that somewhere in the earth and stone, that fierce, loyal spirit was listening. When Jack Brennan finally died at 78, peacefully in his sleep, the valley mourned him as one of their own. He was buried next to Ranger, their markers side by side, and the dedication read, Jack Brennan, he learned to stand. The Montana Heritage Alliance established a scholarship in his name for students studying preservation and indigenous history. The Brennan Ranch became a model for community-driven conservation, proof that one person and one horse could change the course of history if they refused to give up. And on quiet evenings, when the wind moves through the pines and the valley holds its breath, some say you can still see them. A man and a horse, walking the fence lines, keeping watch over the land they saved together. Guardians eternal, bound by loyalty and love and the simple truth that some doors, once opened by courage, lead home. The first winter without Ranger was the hardest Jack had ever endured, and he'd survived plenty of hard winters in his lifetime. The silence felt wrong, unnatural, as if the valley itself was holding its breath, waiting for the sound of hooves on frozen ground that would never come again. Jack found himself walking to the stable at dawn out of habit, expecting to see that familiar chestnut form standing alert by the door, only to be met with emptiness that carved something hollow in his chest. He'd catch himself buying extra feed at the store, his hand reaching for the familiar bag before memory caught up and reminded him there was no horse waiting to eat it. The grief was physical, a weight that settled in his bones and refused to lift even when spring finally broke through the snow. Grace Kendall noticed, of course. She had a way of seeing through the walls people built around themselves, probably from living 85 years in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business whether they wanted to or not. She started showing up more frequently, always with some excuse about needing to check on the property or wanting company for her evening walk. Jack knew what she was doing and was grateful for it, even if his pride wouldn't let him say so out loud. They'd sit on his porch in the lengthening spring evenings, drinking coffee that was too strong and watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, and Grace would tell stories about the old days, about the valley before the developers came sniffing around, about the people who'd lived and died on this land and left their marks in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. One evening in late April, when the snow had finally retreated to the highest peaks and the grass was beginning to show green through the brown, Grace set down her coffee cup with a decisive clink and fixed Jack with a look that meant she was about to say something he probably didn't want to hear. "You're mourning, and that's right and proper," she said without preamble. "That horse saved your life in more ways than one, and you loved him. But Jack, you're starting to turn that grief into a cage. Same way you used to cage yourself with running. Ranger wouldn't want that." Jack wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but the words died in his throat because she was right and they both knew it. He'd been so focused on what he'd lost that he'd stopped seeing what remained, stopped participating in the very thing Ranger had fought so hard to protect. The archaeological team starts their summer session next month, Grace continued, her voice gentler now. Dr. Porter called me yesterday. They've got funding for a bigger excavation, and they're bringing in students from 3 different universities. They'll need someone who knows the land, who can guide them to the right places and keep them from disturbing what should stay buried. She paused, letting that sink in. They need you, Jack. More importantly, the land needs you. Sitting here staring at an empty stable isn't honoring what you and that horse built together. Living is honoring it. Getting back to work is honoring it. Jack looked out at the pasture where Ranger's grave sat marked by its simple stone, and felt something shift inside him. Grace was right, damn her. He'd been so caught up in absence that he'd forgotten presence, forgotten that the best way to honor the dead was to keep living the values they died protecting. The summer excavation transformed the ranch in ways Jack hadn't anticipated. What had been a quiet preservation site became a bustling hub of activity, with tents and equipment spread across the eastern pasture and trucks arriving daily with supplies and personnel. Dr. Porter arrived in mid-May with a team of 15, a mix of graduate students, professional archaeologists, and tribal representatives from not just the Blackfeet Nation but also the Salish and Kootenai peoples whose ancestors had used this valley long before white settlement. The energy they brought was infectious, their excitement over every small discovery reminding Jack why this work mattered. He found himself pulled into their rhythm, waking early to help set up work sites, spending his days guiding teams to areas Walter's notes had identified as significant, and his evenings listening to the researchers discuss their findings over communal dinners in the mess tent they'd erected. William Running Wolf returned as the primary tribal liaison, and he and Jack developed a friendship built on comfortable silences and shared purpose. William had a way of reading the land that went beyond academic training, a connection to place that Jack envied and tried to learn from. They'd walk the property together at dawn, William pointing out plants Jack had never noticed, explaining their traditional uses and the stories attached to them, teaching him to see the valley not just as terrain to be protected but as a living entity with its own memory and wisdom. Your horse understood this, William said one morning as they stood near Ranger's grave watching the sun rise. Animals know things we've forgotten. They remember that everything is connected, that disturbing one thread pulls on all the others. He was trying to teach you that, and you learned. That's rare. The excavation yielded discoveries that made headlines across the region. In addition to the burial sites they'd known about, the team uncovered evidence of a much older settlement pattern, artifacts dating back over 1,000 years indicating that the valley had been a seasonal gathering place for multiple tribes long before the mining era. They found tools, pottery fragments, and the remains of structures that spoke to a sophisticated understanding of the land's resources. Each discovery was meticulously documented, treated with the reverence it deserved, and the tribal representatives performed ceremonies to honor the ancestors whose belongings were being brought back into the light. Jack participated in these ceremonies when invited, standing quietly at the edges and feeling the weight of history settling around him like a cloak. This was what Ranger had known was here, what Walter had died trying to protect. Not treasure in the conventional sense, but something infinitely more valuable. Truth, memory, connection to a past that deserved to be remembered. By midsummer, the site had attracted attention from the National Park Service. 2 officials arrived unannounced one July morning, driving a government vehicle with federal plates, and requested a tour. Jack led them through the excavation, explaining the history and significance while Dr. Porter provided the technical details. The officials took extensive notes, photographed everything, and asked questions that suggested they were thinking beyond just documentation. At the end of the day, they pulled Jack and Dr. Porter aside for a private conversation that would change everything. We'd like to propose designating this site as a National Historic Landmark, the senior official said, a gray-haired woman named Patricia Chun who spoke with the careful precision of someone used to making decisions that mattered. The combination of indigenous heritage, mining history, and the documentation your uncle compiled makes this one of the most significant sites in Montana. With landmark status comes federal funding, protection, and resources for ongoing research and public education. Jack felt the ground shift beneath him, Not literally, but in the way reality sometimes tilts when something enormous becomes possible. National Historic Landmark status would mean permanent protection, resources for proper preservation, and recognition of the work Walter had started. It would mean Ranger's sacrifice had led to something that would outlast all of them, that would teach future generations about the cost of forgetting history and the courage it takes to remember. Dr. Porter was already nodding enthusiastically, already thinking through the logistics, but Patricia was looking at Jack. "This is your land, Mr. Brennan, or it was. You'd have to agree to transfer full ownership to the National Park Service, with the caveat that you retain lifetime residency rights. It's a lot to consider, and we understand if you need time to think about it." Jack looked past her to where the excavation teams were carefully uncovering another section of the old settlement, their movements slow and respectful. He thought about Walter, about the journal hidden in a fireproof box and a life spent fighting to protect what others wanted to destroy. He thought about Ranger, about loyalty that transcended species and a horse who'd refused to abandon his post even when doing so would have been easier. "I don't need time," Jack said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "Yes, absolutely yes. This land was never really mine anyway. It belongs to the people whose stories are buried here, and if making it a landmark means those stories get told properly, then that's what should happen." Patricia smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her professional demeanor. "Your uncle would be proud. So would that horse everyone keeps telling me about." She extended her hand, and Jack shook it, feeling the weight of the decision settle into something that felt like peace. The paperwork took months to finalize, bureaucracy moving at its characteristic glacial pace. But by October the designation was official. The Brennan Ranch became the Cottonwood Valley National Historic Landmark, with Jack Brennan listed as permanent resident and historical consultant. The announcement made regional news, and suddenly Jack found himself doing interviews, telling the story over and over to reporters who wanted the human interest angle, the broke rancher and the loyal horse who'd saved a valley's history. He hated the attention but understood its necessity. Every story told was another layer of protection, another person who knew what this place was and why it mattered. Emily visited for the dedication ceremony, bringing with her a surprise that made Jack's heart stop when he saw them walking up the drive. His grandson, a 10-year-old boy named Christopher who Jack had only seen in photographs, shy and curious with Emily's dark eyes and Jack's stubborn chin. "He wanted to meet you," Emily said softly, watching Jack's face. "And I thought it was time. Past time, really." Jack knelt down to the boy's level, not trusting his voice, and Christopher looked at him with an intensity that reminded Jack painfully of Ranger's unwavering gaze. "Mom says you're a hero," Christopher said, the words tumbling out fast as if he'd been practicing them. "She says you saved a whole valley and that you had a magic horse who showed you where the treasure was buried." Jack laughed, the sound watery with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Not magic, buddy. Just smart. Smartest horse I ever knew. And I'm not a hero, I just did what needed doing when it would have been easier to run away." Christopher considered this seriously. "But you stayed anyway? Even when it was scary?" Jack nodded. "Even when it was scary. Especially then." The boy's face broke into a gap-toothed grin. "That's what makes heroes. Mom told me." The dedication ceremony was larger than Jack had expected, with representatives from tribal nations, state and federal officials, and what seemed like half the population of Cottonwood Valley. There were speeches about preservation and heritage, about the importance of protecting indigenous history and learning from the mistakes of the past. William Running Wolf spoke about the ancestors whose rest had been disturbed and then honored, about the healing that comes from acknowledgement. Dr. Porter talked about Walter's research and Jack's courage, about how sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with stubbornness and refusal to accept injustice. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he stood at the podium with Christopher holding his hand and looked out at the crowd gathered on the land he'd almost sold without a second thought. "I'm not good with words," he started, his voice rough. "Never have been. But I know this. When I came here 3 years ago, I was running. I'd been running my whole life from anything that asked me to stay, to commit, to care about something more than my own comfort. I was ready to sell this land without knowing what it was, without caring about the people who died here or the history that was buried. And then a horse, injured and alone, led me to a cellar and showed me that some things are worth fighting for even when you're scared, even when you're outmatched, even when every logical part of your brain says to walk away. He paused, emotion making his throat tight. Ranger saved my life by giving me a reason to stop running. My Uncle Walter saved this land by refusing to let it be forgotten. And all of you, everyone who stood with us, who believed this place mattered, you made sure their sacrifices meant something. So thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for helping a broken man and a stubborn horse do something that mattered. The applause that followed felt less like celebration and more like communion, a shared acknowledgement of what they'd preserved together. After the ceremony, people lingered, eating the food local restaurants had donated and exploring the newly constructed visitor center that housed Walter's documents and told the valley's story through carefully curated exhibits. Jack found himself surrounded by well-wishers, people wanting to shake his hand or share their own stories of family connected to the land. An elderly Blackfeet woman pressed something into his palm, and when he looked down, it was a small stone carved with what she explained was a symbol for guardian. "For your horse," she said softly, "to mark his place as protector." Jack could only nod, unable to speak, and later he placed the stone on Ranger's grave where it caught the light and seemed to glow. Winter came again, Jack's fourth in the valley, and this time the silence didn't feel empty. The landmark designation meant regular activity even in the cold months, with researchers working on documents in the visitor center and plans being made for spring excavations. Jack spent his days maintaining the property, giving occasional tours to hardy visitors who didn't mind the cold, and working on a project Dr. Porter had suggested. Writing down everything he remembered about Walter's research, about finding the cellar, about Ranger's behavior and the discoveries that followed. "It's oral history," she'd explained. "Your perspective matters. Future researchers will want to know not just what was found but how it was found, the human story behind the preservation." Jack had resisted at first, convinced he had nothing interesting to say. But once he started writing, the words came easier than expected. He wrote about his failures and fears, about being the kind of man who ran from responsibility, about how an injured horse had seen something in him he hadn't known existed. The manuscript grew slowly through the winter months, pages accumulating on his desk as Jack tried to capture not just events but feelings, the transformation that happens when someone stops running and plants roots. Emily read drafts and offered feedback, and Christopher, during winter break, would sit beside Jack and ask questions that helped him clarify his thoughts. "Why did you almost sell the land, Grandpa?" the boy asked one evening, his voice genuinely curious rather than judgmental. Jack thought about how to answer, wanting to be honest without making excuses. "Because I was scared," he finally said. "Scared of staying in one place, scared of caring about something enough that losing it would hurt, scared of being the person I thought I couldn't be. Fear makes us do stupid things sometimes." Christopher nodded seriously. "But Ranger wasn't scared." Jack smiled. "No, buddy. Ranger was scared, I think. Scared and hurt and alone. But he did the brave thing anyway, and that taught me something important. Courage isn't not being scared. It's being scared and doing what's right regardless." Spring arrived with the manuscript finished, 200 pages that Dr. Porter declared publishable and important. A small university press agreed to release it as part of a series on Western conservation stories, and Jack found himself with another new identity: author. It felt absurd and wonderful in equal measure, this idea that his words might matter to people he'd never meet, that the story of a broke rancher and a loyal horse could inspire others to stand their ground when it would be easier to surrender. The book's publication coincided with the 5th anniversary of the landmark designation, and Jack did a reading at the visitor center that was attended by more people than the building could comfortably hold. He read the final chapter, the one about Ranger's death and burial, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room when he finished. Afterward, people lined up to have him sign copies, and Jack obliged even though his hand cramped and his face hurt from smiling. That summer brought another surprise, this one in the form of a young woman who arrived at the ranch in June driving a trailer with a horse inside. Her name was Jessica Martin. She was 26, and she'd read Jack's book during a particularly difficult period in her own life. "Your story made me realize I'd been running too," she explained as Jack helped her unload a bay gelding named Copper. From family expectations, from a career I hated, from every hard choice I needed to make. So I quit my job, bought this horse, and decided to work in preservation. Dr. Porter hired me as an intern for the summer, and I was hoping, if you'd be willing, you might teach me about the land. About how to see it the way Ranger taught you to see it. Jack looked at the young woman, at the hope and determination in her face, and saw himself 5 years ago. Lost, searching, needing someone to believe in him before he could believe in himself. I'd be honored, he said. But fair warning, I'm still learning myself. We'll figure it out together. Jessica became a fixture at the ranch that summer, working with the excavation team during the day and spending her evenings helping Jack with property maintenance and learning the stories embedded in the landscape. Copper, the bay gelding, proved to be as intelligent and attentive as Ranger had been, though in his own quieter way. Jack found himself telling Jessica stories about Ranger, about the night the horse had led him to the cellar, about the standoffs with Hutchins' men and the way Ranger had refused to back down. He was extraordinary, Jessica said one evening as they stood near the grave marker. But I think maybe he saw that you were extraordinary too, and he just helped you remember that. Jack wanted to dismiss the compliment but found he couldn't. Maybe she was right. Maybe Ranger had seen potential in him that he'd buried under years of running and self-doubt. And maybe the horse's gift hadn't been showing him where treasure was buried but showing him who he could become if he stopped running long enough to try. The years continued their progression, marked by seasons and ceremonies, by new discoveries in the ground and new relationships above it. Jessica returned every summer, eventually completing her graduate degree with a thesis on community-driven preservation that used the Cottonwood Valley landmark as a case study. She brought Copper each time, and the horse became another guardian of the land, gentle with visitors but watchful in a way that reminded Jack powerfully of Ranger. Christopher grew from a curious 10-year-old into a thoughtful teenager who spent his summers volunteering at the landmark, giving tours and helping with excavations. He'd inherited Jack's quiet determination and Emily's intelligence, and watching him explain the valley's history to visitors with passion and knowledge made Jack's chest swell with a pride he'd never expected to feel. On a clear October evening during Jack's 9th year in the valley, he stood on the hill overlooking the property with William Running Wolf, watching the sun set over mountains that had witnessed countless sunsets before theirs and would witness countless more after. The excavation season was winding down, tents being disassembled and equipment packed for winter storage. The visitor center glowed with warm light, and Jack could hear laughter from the research team having a farewell dinner inside. "Your uncle would hardly recognize this place," William said quietly. "What was one man's desperate attempt to preserve truth has become something that serves an entire region, that teaches thousands of people every year about respecting history and learning from mistakes." Jack nodded, feeling the weight of those 9 years settling into something that felt like completion. "I almost sold it," he said, "not for the first time. Came this close to taking Hutchins' money and running. If Ranger hadn't been here, hadn't been so damn stubborn about making me see what this place was, none of this would exist." William smiled. "But he was here and you did see. That's what matters. The land has a way of calling the people it needs when it needs them. Your uncle, then Ranger, then you. Now Jessica and Christopher and all the others who've been touched by this story. The circle keeps expanding, and that's how preservation becomes permanent. Not through laws or designations, though those help, but through hearts changed and minds opened." They stood in comfortable silence as darkness gathered, stars beginning to prick the sky. Jack thought about the man he'd been when he first drove up that driveway. Broke, alone, ready to sell out and disappear. And he thought about who he'd become. Author, consultant, guardian of a land that had given him purpose and peace. The transformation felt impossible and inevitable both, as if this had always been his destination but he'd needed to take the long, hard road to reach it. Jack Brennan lived another 8 years on the Cottonwood Valley landmark, dying peacefully at 79 in the cabin he'd built with his own hands. He was surrounded by family. Emily, Christopher, and Christopher's young daughter Lily, who at 5 years old was already showing signs of her great-grandfather's stubborn determination. Jessica was there too, having become family in all the ways that mattered, and William Running Wolf arrived just before the end to sing the songs that help spirits transition. Jack's last words were about Ranger, about needing to check on the horse, and Emily held his hand and told him gently that Ranger was waiting, that they'd walk the fence lines together again soon. He smiled at that, squeezed her hand, and let go. The funeral was held on the hill where Ranger was buried, and Jack was laid to rest beside the horse who'd saved him, their markers side by side as they'd stood in life. The entire valley came out to pay respects, along with researchers and tribal representatives and people whose lives had been touched by Jack's story. Christopher, now a man of 23 studying environmental law, gave the eulogy. He spoke about his grandfather's courage, about the legacy of protection Jack had built, about how one person's choice to stay and fight could ripple outward to change an entire region's future. He taught me that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be, Christopher said, his voice strong despite his tears. That courage isn't some innate quality you either have or don't, but a choice you make every day to show up, to care, to stand for something bigger than yourself. And he taught me that sometimes the greatest teachers come in unexpected forms, like an injured horse who refused to give up on the land he loved. The Montana Heritage Alliance established the Jack Brennan Fellowship for Emerging Preservationists, providing funding for young people to work on heritage sites across the West. Jessica Martin was named the first director of the fellowship program, bringing to the role the same passion and dedication she'd learned during her summers at Cottonwood Valley. Christopher finished law school and joined a firm specializing in indigenous rights and land preservation, using his great-uncle's documents and his grandfather's story as foundations for legal arguments that protected other threatened sites. Lily, as she grew, spent every summer at the landmark, learning its stories and developing the same deep connection to land that had defined Jack's transformation. The work continued, as Jack had known it would, because the best legacies aren't built by individuals, but by communities committed to shared values. On the 10th anniversary of Jack's death, the National Park Service unveiled a new exhibit at the Visitor Center titled Guardians, the story of Walter Brennan, Jack Brennan, and Ranger. It included photographs, documents, and artifacts, but also interactive elements that let visitors understand the excavation process and the importance of preserving indigenous heritage. The centerpiece was a life-sized bronze sculpture of Ranger, created by a Blackfeet artist named Thomas Whitepine, that captured the horse in mid-stride with his head turned as if looking back to make sure someone was following. Children loved climbing on the statue, and adults would often stand before it in silence, reading the plaque that explained how one horse's loyalty had catalyzed the protection of an entire valley's history. At the base of the sculpture, someone had placed a fresh apple, a tradition that had started spontaneously and continued, visitors leaving offerings for a horse who'd become legend. Emily, gray-haired now and grandmother herself, stood before the sculpture on the anniversary evening and felt her father's presence as clearly as if he were standing beside her. She'd spent so many years angry at him for his absences, for choosing running over family, that she'd almost missed his transformation when it happened. But the last decade of his life had rewritten their relationship, had given her back a father she'd thought lost, and for that she would always be grateful to this land and the horse who'd called him home. "Thank you," she whispered to Ranger's bronze form. "Thank you for seeing what he could be and refusing to let him hide from it." A hand touched her shoulder, and she turned to find Christopher with his arm around Lily, 3 generations standing together in the place that had become their family's heart. The valley settled into its rhythms, seasons turning as they always had, the land remembering everything even as individual memories faded. The Cottonwood Valley National Historic Landmark continued its work, each year bringing new discoveries, new visitors, new minds open to the importance of preserving what came before. And on certain evenings when the light slanted just right across the eastern pasture, when the wind moved through the grass in particular ways, people swore they could see them. 2 figures walking the fence line, one human and one horse, checking that everything remained as it should, guardians eternal watching over the land they'd fought so hard to save. Whether these were ghosts or tricks of light or simply the valley's way of honoring its protectors, no one could say for certain. But it brought comfort, this idea that some bonds transcend death, that loyalty and love and shared purpose create connections that outlast the flesh that houses them. Jack Brennan and Ranger had become part of the land's story, woven into its memory as thoroughly as the indigenous peoples who'd gathered there for centuries or the miners who'd died in its depths. They were legend now, but legend built on truth, and in the end, that was the greatest treasure they'd uncovered. Not gold or artifacts or even justice, though all those mattered, but the simple truth that one person choosing to stay, to care, to fight, can change everything for everyone who comes after. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.